They always tell you that death reveals the truth. What they don't tell you is how much that truth can destroy everything you thought you knew about your life. I'm standing in a funeral home, 42 years old, staring at my father's casket, and across from me is a woman I've never seen before. She's crying the way I'm crying, holding tissues the way I'm holding tissues. And when the funeral director approaches her, he calls her Mrs. Thompson. That's my mother's name. That's my name. But my mother is standing right beside me, and this woman, this stranger, is wearing a wedding ring that looks exactly like the one my father never took off. For 30 years, I called this man Dad. I watched him leave for work every Monday and come home every Friday. I believed his stories about business trips and conferences. I trusted his excuses about missing birthdays and holidays. And now, in this small chapel filled with flowers and hymns, I'm learning that everything I knew was carefully constructed fiction. The woman across from me just whispered to the funeral director, asking when she can take her husband home. Her husband. My father. And that's when I realized that one of us has been living in a lie our entire lives. The question is, which one? And what happens when two families discover they've been sharing the same man without ever knowing the other existed? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this woman who seemed to know my father as intimately as I did? Why did she believe she had the right to call herself his widow? And how did my father manage to maintain two completely separate lives for 3 decades without either family discovering the truth? Was my childhood a performance? Were his promises to me the same promises he made to another daughter somewhere else? Did he love us both, or were we both just obligations he couldn't escape? And most haunting of all, when he closed his eyes for the last time, which family did he think about? Which life did he wish had been his only one? Some secrets die with the people who keep them. Others explode at funerals, in front of strangers and family members who suddenly realize they never really knew each other at all. Tonight, you're going to hear a story about a man who built 2 worlds, 2 families, and 2 versions of himself. And you're going to meet the daughter who had to piece together the truth from fragments of lies, legal documents, and the devastating testimony of a woman who believed she was the only Mrs. Thompson in the world. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's a story about identity, about what happens when the foundation of your entire existence cracks open, and you have to decide who you're going to be when everything you believe turns out to be false. My name is Sarah Thompson. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a modest 3-bedroom house with a backyard that my father built a swing set in when I was 5 years old. My mother, Linda, worked as a nurse at the county hospital. She did double shifts, holidays, weekends, whatever it took to keep our household running. And my father, Robert Thompson, worked in commercial real estate development. At least that's what he told us. He traveled constantly. Monday mornings, he'd pack his leather briefcase, kiss my mother on the cheek, kiss me on the forehead, and promise to be home by Friday evening. And he always was. Every single Friday, like clockwork, he'd pull into our driveway around 6 in the evening, tired but smiling, with stories about clients and construction sites and business meetings that ran too long. I never questioned it. Why would I? He was my father. He taught me how to ride a bike, helped me with my math homework, attended my high school graduation, and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. He wasn't perfect. He missed some birthdays. He couldn't always make it to my dance recitals or school plays. But my mother always explained it away with the same patient understanding. Your father works hard for this family, she'd say. He's doing his best. And I believed her because I had no reason not to. Our life wasn't extravagant, but it was stable. We took modest vacations, celebrated holidays together, and created what I thought were genuine memories of a normal, loving family. My father had his quirks. He never gave us his work phone number, only his pager. He never invited us to visit his office. He kept his work life and home life rigidly separated, but that seemed reasonable for a man who traveled so much. He didn't want us bothering him during important meetings, he'd say. He wanted to focus on us when he was home, give us his full attention without work distractions. Looking back now, every explanation was a carefully crafted excuse. Every boundary he set was designed to keep his two worlds from colliding. But I didn't see it then. None of us did. My mother loved him with a quiet, enduring patience. She never complained about his absences, never questioned his devotion, never seemed to doubt that he was exactly where he said he was. And I grew up believing that marriage sometimes meant sacrifice, that love sometimes meant accepting that your partner had responsibilities that took them away from home. I thought my parents had a solid marriage built on trust and understanding. I thought my father was a hard-working man who loved his family enough to spend weeks away from us to provide for our needs. I thought I knew who Robert Thompson was. I was wrong about everything. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at work, sitting at my desk reviewing client files, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was professional, clinical, detached. "This is Mercy Hospital calling for family of Robert Thompson. He was brought in this morning with a massive heart attack. He's in critical condition. You need to come now." My hands started shaking before my brain could fully process what I was hearing. I called my mother immediately, and within 30 minutes, we were both speeding toward the hospital, our minds racing with fear and prayer and desperate hope that we'd get there in time. We didn't. By the time we arrived, my father was already gone. The doctor met us in a quiet hallway, his face carrying that expression medical professionals develop when they've delivered bad news too many times. "I'm so sorry," he said. "We did everything we could." My mother collapsed into a chair, her face blank with shock, and I stood there feeling like the ground had opened beneath my feet. And then the doctor said something that should have warned me. He said, "The other family has already been notified. They're in the waiting room." I remember looking at him confused. "What other family?" My mother and I exchanged glances. We thought he meant distant relatives, cousins we barely knew, people my father might have listed as emergency contacts. We had no idea what was coming. When we walked into that waiting room, we saw her, a woman about my mother's age, maybe a few years younger, with graying hair and red eyes, clutching the hand of a young woman who looked to be in her mid-20s. They were both crying, and when they looked up and saw us, their expressions shifted from grief to confusion, and then to something that looked like recognition mixed with horror. The older woman stood up slowly, staring at my mother, and said in a voice that trembled with emotion and disbelief, "Who are you?" My mother, still in shock, said quietly, "I'm Linda Thompson, Robert's wife." And that's when the other woman's face went pale. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth, and said, No, that's not possible. I'm Margaret Thompson. I'm Robert's wife." The room went silent. Even the hospital sounds seemed to fade into background static. I looked at this woman, at this stranger who was claiming my father, claiming my mother's identity, claiming a place in a life I thought belonged only to us. And she was looking at us with the exact same confusion and horror. Neither of us was lying. Neither of us was confused. We both had documentation, wedding rings, years of memories, and the absolute certainty that we were Robert Thompson's family. My mother found her voice first. "We've been married for 32 years, she said, her voice shaking but clear. "We have a daughter. We have a home in Portland." The other woman, Margaret, shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face now. "We've been married for 28 years. We have a daughter, too. We live in Seattle." And that's when everything I thought I knew about my life shattered into pieces too small to ever put back together. The funeral home became a battlefield of documents and proof and desperate attempts by two families to claim legitimacy over a man who apparently belonged to neither of us completely. Margaret produced a marriage certificate dated 1995. My mother produced one dated 1991. Margaret had photos of my father at her daughter Emily's graduation. My mother had photos of him at mine. Margaret knew his favorite meal, his coffee order, the scar on his left shoulder from a childhood accident. So did my mother. Every piece of evidence one family presented, the other could match. And slowly, painfully, we began to realize that Robert Thompson hadn't chosen one family over another. He'd maintained both, simultaneously, for nearly 3 decades. The logistics seemed impossible. How do you live 2 complete lives? How do you remember 2 sets of anniversaries, 2 daughters' birthdays, 2 homes with different furniture and different routines? Margaret's family lived in Seattle, a 3-hour drive from Portland. Robert told Margaret he was a consultant who worked in Portland during the week and came home to Seattle on weekends. He told my mother and me that he worked in Seattle during the week and came home to Portland on weekends. He structured his entire existence around a schedule that kept his 2 worlds from ever touching. Monday through Friday in Portland with us. Friday evening through Monday morning in Seattle with them. Business trips that were actually time with the other family. Holidays strategically split with excuses about work obligations that sounded reasonable to whichever family wasn't seeing him. My mother and I started going through my father's belongings with new eyes, looking for evidence of his double life, and we found it everywhere. A second cell phone hidden in his car. Credit card statements for purchases in Seattle that he'd kept meticulously separate from our household accounts. Receipts from restaurants and stores in neighborhoods we'd never heard of. A storage unit neither of us knew existed, filled with duplicate belongings, gifts, clothes, an entire second wardrobe for his second life. And the most devastating discovery was a journal. My father kept a journal. Pages and pages of handwritten entries documenting his guilt, his fear of discovery, his love for both families, his inability to choose, his growing certainty that eventually everything would collapse and destroy everyone he loved. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew it couldn't last forever. But he kept doing it anyway, year after year, building elaborate structures of lies to protect the truth from everyone, including himself. Margaret and I met without our mothers 3 days after the funeral. We sat in a coffee shop, 2 women who were technically stepsisters, but felt more like victims of the same crime. She told me about her childhood, about the father who came home every weekend with gifts and stories and attention. I told her about mine, about the man who was always there when it mattered, who made me feel loved and valued, even though he was gone most of the week. Our stories were identical. We'd lived parallel lives, loved the same man, believed the same lies, and never once suspected that we were sharing him with someone else. Emily, Margaret's daughter, was 26, 4 years younger than me. She had his eyes, his smile, his terrible sense of humor. Looking at her was like looking at an alternate version of myself, a sister I never knew existed, born from a marriage that legally should not have been possible. The legal implications were staggering. My father had committed bigamy, a crime in both Oregon and Washington. He'd filed false tax returns. He'd fraudulently maintained 2 separate identities with 2 social security numbers, something we discovered when the lawyers got involved. He'd built an entire infrastructure of deception that required constant maintenance and vigilance, and for 28 years, he'd somehow managed to keep it all running without either family discovering the truth. Until his heart gave out in a Seattle hotel room during what my mother thought was a business trip and what Margaret thought was a normal work week in Portland. 3 weeks after the funeral, Margaret called me. Her voice sounded different, harder, like she'd made a decision that was going to hurt but needed to be done anyway. "We need to talk about the will," she said. "I need you to come to Seattle." I drove up the next day, and Margaret met me at a lawyer's office downtown. The attorney, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a stack of documents that seemed impossibly thick, explained the situation with careful, precise language. "Your father," she began, "made provisions for both families. He was apparently quite wealthy, much wealthier than either of you knew. That's when the real revelation began. My father wasn't just a real estate consultant. He was a real estate developer who'd built a multi-million-dollar portfolio of properties across Washington and Oregon over 3 decades. The modest house I grew up in, the careful budgeting my mother maintained, the scholarship money I needed for college, it was all theater. My father had money, lots of it. But he kept both families on tight budgets, maintained the illusion of middle-class struggle, because it was easier to explain his absences and his careful control over finances if we believed he was working hard just to make ends meet. In reality, he owned apartment buildings, commercial properties, and investment portfolios worth close to $8 million. The will divided everything equally between his two families, half to my mother and me, half to Margaret and Emily. But the twist, the devastating detail that made everything even more complicated, was a letter he'd left to be read only after his death. The lawyer handed us copies, and Margaret and I read together, sitting side by side, as our father explained himself from beyond the grave. He wrote about meeting my mother in 1991, falling in love, getting married with genuine intentions of building a life together. Then, in 1995, during a work trip to Seattle, he met Margaret. He described it as lightning striking twice, as meeting someone who understood him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Instead of ending his marriage to my mother, he married Margaret too, convincing himself that he could make both relationships work, that he could love two women and two families without either one being less legitimate or valued. He wrote about the guilt that consumed him, the nights he couldn't sleep, the constant fear of discovery. But he also wrote about his love for all of us, about how every moment with each family felt genuine and real, about how he couldn't imagine choosing one life over the other without destroying half of who he was. He rationalized his choices with tangled logic about protecting us from pain, about giving us stable childhoods, about his belief that we were all better off not knowing the truth. And he apologized, not for loving us, but for lying to us, for building our lives on foundations of deception that he knew would eventually crumble. The letter ended with a plea for us to forgive him, to understand that he was weak rather than malicious, that his choices came from cowardice rather than cruelty. He asked us to take care of each other, to become the family he'd never allowed us to be. Margaret looked at me when we finished reading, her eyes empty of tears because she'd cried too much already, and said, "Do you think he loved us?" It was the question we'd both been asking ourselves since the funeral, and I realized that the answer was yes and no, and something far more complicated than either word could capture. He loved us. He also betrayed us. He built beautiful moments with each of us, while simultaneously making those moments less meaningful by repeating them with someone else. He gave us versions of himself that were real but incomplete, and he left us with the impossible task of reconciling the father we knew with the man who lied to us every single day of our lives. My mother never recovered from the truth. She filed for an annulment, a legal declaration that her marriage had never been valid because my father was already married when he married her. It took 2 years, but eventually the courts agreed. 32 years of her life, erased with paperwork and judicial signatures. She moved to Arizona to live near her sister, somewhere far from Portland and Seattle, and every reminder of the life she thought she'd built. We talk on the phone every Sunday, but something in her voice is gone, some fundamental trust in reality that she'll never get back. She tells me she's okay, that she's healing, but I hear the hollowness underneath her words. My father didn't just lie to her. He stole her confidence in her own judgment, her ability to trust her perceptions, her belief that love means something solid and true. Margaret struggled differently. She stayed in Seattle, in the house my father bought for them, but every room became a museum of lies. She'd look at photos on the wall and wonder which ones were taken during weeks when he was supposed to be working in Portland with my mother and me. She'd remember anniversaries and vacations and tender moments, and then she'd calculate whether those dates overlapped with similar moments he was having with us. Eventually, she sold the house and moved into a small apartment downtown. She said she needed to start over in a space that didn't carry his ghost in every corner. Emily, her daughter, my half-sister, became my unlikely support system. We started meeting for coffee once a month, then twice, then weekly. We'd talk about our childhoods, about the father we both loved and both lost in different ways. We'd share stories and realize that we'd lived almost identical experiences in different cities. The bike riding lessons, the bedtime stories, the advice about boys and school and life. He'd given us the same father, recycled across 2 lives, and somehow that made it both more painful and more bearable. We weren't alone in our grief or our anger or our confusion. 2 years after my father's death, Emily and I scattered half his ashes in the Columbia River near Portland and half in Puget Sound near Seattle. Our mothers didn't come. They'd said their goodbyes in their own ways, in their own time, and didn't need public ceremonies to mark the end of something that had already ended years before. But Emily and I stood on those shores and said goodbye to the father we thought we knew, and to the man he actually was, and to the fantasy that we'd ever fully understand him or why he made the choices he made. We released him into water that would carry him away from both of us, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, not even understanding, but acceptance that some questions don't have answers, and some betrayals are too complex to categorize as simply good or evil. I learned that people are capable of loving you and lying to you simultaneously, that you can be someone's daughter and still not really know them, that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives are often carefully edited versions of more complicated truths. And I learned that family isn't just about biology or legal documents or shared last names. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. Emily showed up. Margaret showed up in her own wounded way. My mother survived and rebuilt. And I found strength I didn't know I had in the process of piecing together a life from the wreckage of my father's deceptions. 3 years have passed now. I'm 45 years old. I'm married to a good man who knows my whole story and loves me anyway. I have a daughter of my own, and I tell her the truth about everything, even when it's hard, because I never want her to discover that her reality was a performance. And sometimes I think about my father, about the weight he must have carried, about the constant vigilance required to maintain 2 lives, and I feel something like pity mixed with my anger. He trapped himself in a prison of his own making, and he died there, alone, without either family knowing his full truth. So let me ask you something. If you discovered tomorrow that your parent, your partner, or someone you trusted completely had been living a double life, what would you do? Would you walk away completely, cutting ties with someone who betrayed your trust so fundamentally? Would you try to understand, to find compassion for the complexity of human weakness? Or would you do what Emily and I did, building something new from the broken pieces of what you thought you knew? How do you forgive someone who never gave you the chance to confront them about their lies? How do you reconcile love with betrayal when they come from the same source? And if you were in Margaret's position, learning that you were the second wife, the other family, how would you process that your entire marriage was built on a lie that invalidated everything you thought was real? Comment below and tell me where you're watching from and how you'd handle discovering a secret family. Would you want to know your half-siblings? Would you fight for your share of the inheritance, or walk away from anything connected to the person who deceived you? Your story might help someone else who's walking through their own version of this nightmare right now, trying to make sense of a truth that changes everything they thought they knew about their past. And if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that truth matters and honesty is the foundation everything else is built on, subscribe to this channel, because next week I'm bringing you another story that will challenge everything you think you know about family loyalty, sacrifice, and the lies we tell ourselves to survive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, the truth might hurt, but it's the only thing that sets you free.